They laughed when I said, "I'm not a member." Minutes later, they called the police to throw me out, never imagining the stranger they mocked had just become the legal owner of the home their HOA president was renting. Welcome back, everyone. Before today's story begins, I want to thank each and every one of you for being here. If this is your first time on the channel, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you'll always know when a new story is released. Your support means more than you know. Every like, comment, and subscription helps this channel grow and allows us to keep sharing incredible stories with viewers around the world. And before we begin, tell me this: where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments. I always enjoy seeing how far these stories travel. Now, grab a comfortable seat, relax, and let's dive into today's unforgettable story. I learned a long time ago that the most dangerous people aren't the ones who raise their voices. They're the ones who smile while they're quietly stealing something they have no right to touch. The first thing I noticed that Saturday morning wasn't the crowd. It was the smell of fresh mulch drifting across the entrance of Ashford Ridge, mixed with the sharp scent of newly painted white fences baking under the Texas sun. Everything looked staged. Perfect lawns, matching mailboxes, American flags fluttering in identical angles. The kind of neighborhood where perfection wasn't appreciated, it was enforced. I eased my dusty gray pickup to a stop in front of the stone entrance, killed the engine, and reached for the thick envelope resting on the passenger seat. Inside were the closing documents I'd signed less than 24 hours earlier. Months of negotiations, endless inspections, wire transfers, every signature complete. This little brick house at the end of Cedar Hollow Lane officially belonged to me. I climbed out, boots crunching against the gravel shoulder, enjoying the familiar sound that reminded me of every renovation project I'd ever taken on. Buying neglected properties wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. I liked breathing life back into forgotten homes. No fancy suits, no luxury cars, just calloused hands, faded jeans, and enough patience to outlast bad decisions made by other people. I had barely reached the front gate when someone cleared her throat behind me. "Excuse me." The voice carried the polished confidence of someone who had never once expected to hear the word no. I turned slowly. A woman in an immaculate cream-colored blouse stood with 3 other residents behind her. Her sunglasses reflected the morning sun like mirrors. A clipboard rested comfortably under one arm as though she'd been born holding it. "I'm Linda Whitaker," she announced before I had a chance to speak. "President of the Ashford Ridge Homeowners Association." Not hello, not welcome, just a title. She looked me up and down, lingering on my work boots before letting out a smile, so practiced it felt colder than silence. "You don't belong here." I glanced toward the house. "I think I do." "No," she replied, tapping the clipboard with one manicured finger. "You're not on our membership list." For a second, I almost laughed. Instead, I answered with the simplest sentence I could think of. "That's because I'm not a member." The words landed like gasoline on a campfire. The smile disappeared from her face. The neighbors exchanged quick looks, as though I'd confessed to a felony instead of stating a fact. Linda folded her arms. "So you're admitting you're trespassing?" "I didn't say that. You literally admitted you aren't part of this community." I held the envelope a little tighter, but never opened it. There was no point. Not yet. Some lessons only work when people are allowed to finish writing their own mistakes. She pulled out her phone. "I've dealt with people like you before." I stayed exactly where I was. The warm breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass across the street, while somewhere nearby a lawn sprinkler hissed rhythmically against the pavement. Behind lace curtains, faces began appearing in windows. Garage doors opened one by one. Within moments, half the cul-de-sac had found a reason to be outside. Linda pressed the phone to her ear. "Yes, I'd like to report a trespasser refusing to leave private property." She never looked away from me. Not once. I simply slipped my truck keys into my pocket and waited. Because every second that passed meant another witness. Another camera. Another recorded statement. Another page in a story that was about to end very differently than anyone standing there imagined. The first patrol car rolled into the cul-de-sac exactly 6 minutes later, tires whispering over the smooth asphalt as blue lights reflected across polished garage doors and spotless pickup trucks. Nobody in the neighborhood looked surprised. If anything, they looked entertained. Lawn chairs appeared on front porches. Coffee mugs found their way into curious hands. It was as if Saturday morning had suddenly become free live entertainment. I stayed where I was. Years of buying distressed properties had taught me something valuable. Paperwork wins arguments. Emotions only make them louder. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped out first. Mid-40s, calm eyes, the kind of posture that suggested he'd spent enough years answering neighborhood disputes to recognize when something smelled off before anyone even opened their mouth. His younger partner, Officer Melissa Grant, followed behind him with a small tablet already open for notes. Linda wasted no time. "There he is," she declared, pointing directly at me as though identifying an escaped criminal. "He's trespassing on private HOA property and refuses to leave." Officer Brooks looked toward me. "Morning, sir." "Morning. You own this property?" "I do." Linda laughed loudly enough for half the street to hear. "He admitted he isn't an HOA member." Brooks blinked once. "I'm sorry, what?" "He said he's not a member," Linda repeated triumphantly. "Therefore he has no right to be here." The silence that followed lasted maybe 3 seconds. Long enough for Brooks to glance at his partner before looking back at Linda. "Ma'am, membership and ownership aren't automatically the same thing." Her confident smile stiffened. "This subdivision requires membership." "Maybe," Brooks answered evenly. "That still doesn't determine who owns a house." I noticed Melissa quietly watching both of us instead of writing anything down. That was usually a good sign. Brooks turned back toward me. "Do you have identification?" I handed him my driver's license without another word. "No deed." Linda interrupted. "He should have to prove himself." "I can," I answered. I patted the thick document envelope resting under my arm. "But nobody's asked." Linda crossed her arms harder. "He's stalling." The smell of fresh coffee drifted from somewhere across the street while sprinklers continued ticking methodically across emerald green lawns. The entire neighborhood seemed frozen between curiosity and expectation. Brooks ran my license through dispatch. While we waited, Linda couldn't help herself. "You know," she said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "this is exactly what happens when investors think they can buy their way into established communities." I smiled politely. She mistook that for weakness. "You people never understand neighborhood standards." I let the words pass. Every insult sounded stronger in front of witnesses than it ever would in court. Melissa finally spoke. "So, when did you purchase the property?" "Yesterday afternoon." Linda scoffed. "Impossible." I looked at her. "Why?" "Because I would have known." There it was. The sentence she'd probably repeated 1,000 times during her years running the HOA. I would have known. Brooks' radio crackled. "Dispatch confirms driver's identification." He nodded slightly before listening again. His expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Copy that." He lowered the radio. "Sir, county records show a property transfer was recorded yesterday." Linda immediately stepped closer. "That doesn't mean this house." Brooks looked at the address on his screen. "It does." Her face tightened. "But he still isn't an HOA member." I almost laughed. She was clinging to that sentence like it could somehow outweigh county ownership records. Brooks remained patient. "Ma'am, whether he's required to join the HOA is a civil matter. He cannot enter." "Actually," Brooks replied carefully, "unless there's a court order preventing access, ownership generally gives someone the right to enter their own property." The whispers behind us grew louder. For the first time all morning, I noticed uncertainty spreading through the crowd. Not because anyone suddenly believed me, because Linda had stopped sounding certain. She glanced toward the unopened envelope in my hands, then back at the officers, then at the house. For the first time since I'd arrived, she wasn't looking at me like an intruder. She was looking at me like a problem she hadn't planned for. Most people think arrogance arrives with shouting. They're wrong. Real arrogance wears a pleasant smile, speaks in measured tones, and genuinely believes the rules exist only for everyone else. Linda recovered faster than I expected. She squared her shoulders, adjusted the clipboard beneath her arm, and flashed the officers another polished smile that probably worked wonders at HOA board meetings. "Well," she said, "ownership doesn't change our governing documents." Officer Brooks remained calm. No one said it did. He still can't simply walk in. I looked past her toward the brick house, sitting quietly beneath 2 mature oak trees. The afternoon sun reflected softly off the front windows, and for a brief second I pictured the renovations already forming in my head. New cedar shutters, fresh landscaping, restore the original hardwood floors. It was amazing how quickly people forgot a house was meant to become someone's home instead of someone else's battlefield. Linda stepped sideways, deliberately blocking the stone walkway leading to the front porch. You'll need authorization from the association before occupying the property. I almost asked where she'd found that rule. Instead, I let her keep talking. People reveal far more when they believe they're educating you. I've been president here for 8 years, she continued proudly. I've protected property values longer than you've probably owned investment houses. There it was again. The assumption. Because my truck had faded paint. Because my jeans carried drywall dust. Because my boots had concrete stains. In Linda's world, appearances were evidence. She had already decided exactly who I was. She couldn't have been more wrong. I appreciate your concern, I answered evenly. It isn't concern. It's authority. The word hung in the warm Texas air. Authority. Not responsibility. Not service. Authority. Across the street, a little boy stopped riding his bicycle just long enough to watch the conversation. His father quietly rested one hand on the handlebars, saying nothing. Curtains shifted again inside neighboring homes. Every eye seemed fixed on our little standoff. Melissa glanced toward Brooks. Neither officer interrupted. They were listening. That mattered. Linda pointed toward the decorative stone monument at the subdivision entrance. You see that sign? I nodded. Ashford Ridge has standards. I'm sure it does. We don't allow outsiders creating problems. I smiled politely. Interesting choice of words. What words? Outsiders. Her jaw tightened. You know exactly what I mean. I actually don't. She folded her arms. You aren't part of this community. I looked around slowly. Children playing basketball. A retired couple watering flowers. Someone grilling burgers 2 houses away, the smoky scent drifting lazily through the neighborhood. It seems peaceful, I said. It is. So why call the police? Linda opened her mouth, then stopped. For the first time all morning, she didn't have an immediate answer. Officer Brooks quietly cleared his throat. Ma'am, has this gentleman threatened anyone? No. Damaged property? No. Attempted forced entry? He was about to. I was walking to my front door, I corrected gently. Exactly. Brooks looked back toward Linda. Those aren't necessarily the same thing. Color slowly crept into her cheeks. She turned toward the gathering neighbors instead. Everyone here knows how hard this board works. Several people nodded politely. Not enthusiastically. Politely. There was a difference. One older gentleman shifted uncomfortably before looking down at his shoes. Another neighbor avoided eye contact altogether. Something about their reactions caught my attention. This wasn't admiration. It looked much closer to habit. Linda continued speaking as though delivering a campaign speech. We've spent years keeping undesirable situations from affecting this neighborhood. Undesirable. Another revealing word. Every sentence painted a clearer picture than any introduction ever could. I still hadn't opened the envelope under my arm. The closing documents remained sealed. The warranty deed rested safely inside. So did another document no one standing there knew existed. Not the officers. Not the neighbors. Certainly not Linda. I could have unfolded every page right then and ended the confrontation in less than 30 seconds. But timing has value. Sometimes the truth becomes far more powerful after people have committed themselves completely to the lie. As a warm breeze stirred the oak branches overhead, I noticed a black luxury SUV turning slowly onto Cedar Hollow Lane before stopping halfway down the street. A man in a tailored navy suit stepped out carrying a slim leather portfolio. He looked directly at me. Then he started walking toward our growing crowd with the calm confidence of someone who already knew exactly how this morning was going to end. The man in the navy suit never hurried. He crossed the street with the relaxed confidence of someone who had spent his career solving problems that other people created. The leather portfolio in his left hand barely moved with each step. Expensive shoes. Crisp white shirt. No dramatic entrance. Just quiet certainty. Linda noticed him too. Finally, she smiled again. Oh good, she called out. Our association attorney is here. The man didn't answer. He stopped beside me instead. Morning, Ethan. Morning, Charles. He offered a handshake. I accepted. The expression on Linda's face shifted almost imperceptibly. You know each other? She asked. Charles looked at her with polite confusion. Of course. She recovered quickly. Excellent. Then perhaps you can explain to your client that Ashford Ridge requires compliance before occupancy. Charles tilted his head slightly. My client. Yes. He glanced at me, then back at her. I don't represent the homeowners association. Silence. A breeze stirred the oak leaves overhead, scattering tiny shadows across the sidewalk. Linda blinked. I'm sorry. I represent Mr. Ethan Caldwell. The words landed with the weight of wet concrete. Several neighbors exchanged puzzled looks. Officer Brooks folded his arms without saying a word. Linda forced a nervous laugh. Well, that's unnecessary. Charles smiled politely. I don't believe it is. He opened the leather portfolio with practiced precision and removed several neatly tabbed documents. I still hadn't opened the envelope under my own arm. There was no reason. Charles had anticipated this exact moment. He handed one document to Officer Brooks. Certified warranty deed, recorded yesterday at the county clerk's office. Brooks examined the seal carefully before passing it to Melissa. Everything appeared routine, official, undeniable. Linda leaned forward. He may own the house. Charles nodded. He does. But ownership doesn't exempt him from HOA approval. Perhaps. His voice never rose above a conversational tone. But that's not why I'm here. Linda frowned. Then why are you here? Charles removed another document. Different paper. Different heading. He held it in his hand without showing anyone yet. Because there appears to be confusion regarding another property. I watched Linda's confidence begin to crack for the first time. What property? Charles looked directly at her. The residence located at 14 Cedar Hollow Lane. Her smile returned. That's my address. I know. And you've been leasing it for the past 6 years. She nodded impatiently. Obviously. Charles slowly extended the document toward her. I suggest you read this. She snatched it with visible irritation. The only sounds came from a distant lawn mower and the soft hiss of sprinklers reaching the curb. Nobody spoke. Her eyes moved across the first paragraph, then stopped. She read it again. Color drained from her face so quickly it almost looked painful. No. She turned the page. Her fingers tightened enough to wrinkle the paper. That's impossible. Charles remained perfectly calm. The transaction closed yesterday afternoon. She looked at me, then back at the document, then at Charles. No. I'm afraid yes. Officer Melissa glanced toward Brooks. What exactly am I looking at? Charles answered without hesitation. Notice of ownership transfer for the residential property currently occupied by Ms. Linda Whitaker. The whispers around us multiplied instantly. What? Wait. She rinsed. I thought she owned that place. Across the street, the retired couple stopped watering their roses entirely. The hose continued spilling water into the flower bed while both of them stared. Linda shook her head violently. There has to be some mistake. There isn't. I've lived there for years. I'm aware. My landlord never mentioned selling. Charles gave a sympathetic nod. The previous owner wasn't legally obligated to seek tenant approval before selling the property. Her breathing became noticeably faster. She looked directly at me. You? I met her eyes. Good morning, Ms. Whitaker. For the first time since I'd arrived, she wasn't looking at an outsider. She wasn't looking at a trespasser. She was looking at the man who now legally owned the house she would be driving home to that evening. And suddenly, every word she'd spoken about authority sounded very, very different. The change in Linda's expression was almost imperceptible, but it was there. Confidence didn't disappear all at once. It fractured. First came confusion, then disbelief. Finally, the unmistakable look of someone mentally replaying every sentence she'd spoken over the last 20 minutes, desperately searching for one she could take back. You bought, she whispered, staring at me. Yes. My house. I shook my head gently. No. She looked up hopefully. I bought the property you're leasing. There was an important difference. Ownership belongs to the building. A home belongs to the people living inside it. I had no interest in taking that away. Officer Brooks watched quietly while Charles collected the remaining documents and slid them back into his portfolio. Everything appears to be in order, Brooks said. Mr. Caldwell is the recorded owner of this residence, and the documentation regarding Ms. Whitaker's leased property is a private civil matter. Linda turned toward him as though reaching for a lifeline. You can't just leave. We've resolved the call. But he hasn't committed a crime. She looked around the cul-de-sac, searching for support from the neighbors who had watched her run this community for years. Nobody stepped forward. A few quietly looked away. One woman suddenly became very interested in trimming flowers that didn't actually need trimming. Funny how quickly a crowd disappears when certainty leaves the room. I finally opened the large envelope I'd been carrying since morning. The crisp scent of fresh paper drifted upward as I removed the recorded deed to my newly purchased house. I glanced at the address one more time before folding it neatly again. Months earlier, when this property first appeared on the market, everyone told me not to touch it. The HOA is impossible. The board controls everything. You'll regret it. What they didn't know was that I wasn't buying a dream home. I was buying an opportunity. I've spent nearly 15 years restoring neglected neighborhoods, one property at a time. Not by forcing people out. Not by flipping houses overnight. I buy homes whose owners want to sell, renovate them carefully, and create places families can actually enjoy again. The funny thing about that business is you learn to read people almost as well as buildings. Cracked foundations announce themselves. So do fragile egos. Linda cleared her throat. This changes nothing. Charles raised an eyebrow. I'm curious, he said. In what way? Our governing documents still apply. Possibly. She brightened slightly. There. Charles smiled. But governing documents don't authorize false police reports. Her expression froze. They don't authorize preventing lawful access to privately owned property. Nobody spoke. They also don't authorize board members to personally determine ownership based solely on whether someone appears on a membership roster. The words weren't delivered as threats. They were observations. Somehow, that made them even heavier. Officer Melissa closed her tablet. I think we've got everything we need. Brooks nodded. I'd recommend everyone enjoy the rest of their Saturday. The patrol officers started walking back toward their cruisers. As they reached the street, Brooks glanced over his shoulder. Congratulations on the new house, Mr. Caldwell. Thank you, officer. The engine started. Blue lights never came on. They simply drove away. The silence left behind felt louder than the sirens ever could have. Linda remained standing exactly where she was. The neighborhood remained exactly where it was. Only one thing had changed. The story everyone thought they were watching had completely reversed. And for the first time that morning, I finally stepped onto my own front walkway. Nobody tried to stop me. The front door opened with a slow creak that echoed through the quiet house, carrying with it the faint smell of old cedar, dust, and fresh paint samples someone had left behind during the previous owner's final walkthrough. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floor, revealing decades of scratches that most buyers would have considered flaws. I saw history. Every mark meant someone had lived here. Charles followed me inside, while the murmur of curious neighbors continued outside like distant waves. They're still watching, he said. They'll get bored. I'm not talking about the neighbors. I knew exactly who he meant. Through the living room window, I could still see Linda standing perfectly still at the edge of the sidewalk. She hadn't gone home. She hadn't spoken another word. She simply stared at the house as if refusing to believe reality could change without her permission. Charles placed his portfolio on the kitchen counter. You handled that better than most people would. I've learned something over the years. What's that? The louder someone demands respect, the less authority they usually have. He smiled. I'll remember that. I walked from room to room, mentally planning the renovation. The kitchen cabinets could be saved. The fireplace needed new stonework. Upstairs carpeting would have to go immediately. Beneath it, I was almost certain the original oak flooring still existed. The place had good bones. People did too. Sometimes both were buried under years of neglect. Before leaving, Charles handed me another folder. I almost forgot. Inside were inspection reports, utility transfers, insurance paperwork, and one final envelope marked confidential. I looked up. The seller included this? He insisted. I opened it carefully. Inside sat nearly 2 years of correspondence. Emails, certified letters, violation notices, photographs. Every single one involved the homeowners association. Some were ordinary, others weren't. One homeowner had received daily fines because his work truck remained parked in his own driveway. Another had been threatened over replacing dead bushes with drought-resistant landscaping. An elderly widow had accumulated thousands of dollars in penalties after missing meetings while recovering from surgery. The further I read, the colder the room seemed to become. This isn't normal, I said quietly. Charles nodded. The previous owner documented everything before deciding to move. Why didn't anyone challenge it? They tried. I flipped through another stack. Several letters had simply disappeared from official HOA responses. Meeting requests had never been acknowledged. Appeals had apparently been ignored. One photograph caught my attention. Linda stood in front of the clubhouse, smiling broadly beside a banner reading Community Leadership Awards. Behind the cheerful picture sat handwritten notes from the former owner. She only follows rules when they benefit her. Interesting. I closed the folder. Outside, a moving truck rumbled somewhere farther down the street, its diesel engine breaking the afternoon silence before fading again. Charles watched me carefully. You thinking what I think you're thinking? I'm thinking this neighborhood doesn't have an HOA problem. No, it has a leadership problem. He nodded slowly. Big difference. My phone vibrated. Unknown number. I answered. Mr. Caldwell? Speaking. My name is Rebecca Simmons. I live 3 houses over. Her voice sounded hesitant. I saw what happened this morning. I imagine most people did. There was a nervous laugh. May I ask you something? Of course. Are you really Linda's new landlord? I am. Another pause. Then she spoke so quietly I almost missed it. Maybe someone can finally stand up to her. The line disconnected before I could answer. I stood in the empty living room listening to the soft hum of the air conditioner beginning its first cycle under my ownership. That phone call told me more than any property inspection ever could. Fear had been living in this neighborhood long before I arrived. I hadn't come looking for a fight. I had come to buy a house. But sometimes the moment you unlock a new front door, you also unlock every secret the people around it have been trying to keep hidden. By Monday morning, the neighborhood had gone strangely quiet. Not peaceful. Careful. The usual rhythm of Ashford Ridge still played in the background. Garage doors hummed open before sunrise. Dogs barked behind white picket fences. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from kitchen windows as commuters backed neatly polished SUVs onto the street. But underneath all of it sat something new. People were watching. Not out of curiosity anymore. Out of hope. I spent the first half of the morning inside the house with contractors measuring walls and checking electrical panels. The attic insulation needed replacing. 2 bathroom windows had hidden moisture damage. The furnace was older than I expected, but still salvageable. Real problems. The kind that could actually be fixed with honest work. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. Mr. Caldwell? Speaking. My name is Harold Benson. His voice sounded older, cautious. I've lived here 19 years. What can I do for you, Harold? A long pause. I just wanted to thank you. For what? For standing there on Saturday. I leaned against the kitchen counter. I didn't really do anything. Exactly. His answer surprised me. You didn't yell. You didn't threaten anyone. You simply refused to be bullied. I looked through the front window toward the quiet street. You'd be amazed how uncommon that is around here. Before hanging up, Harold gave me one piece of information that stayed with me all afternoon. Check the county meeting records from 3 years ago. Then the line went dead. Charles arrived less than an hour later carrying 2 cardboard archive boxes instead of his usual leather portfolio. I figured you'd ask. I haven't even called. You were going to. He placed both boxes on the dining room table. County filings. HOA meeting minutes. Property records. Board resolutions. Everything publicly available. The faint smell of old paper filled the room as we opened the first box. It didn't take long. Pattern recognition is part of my business. One bad decision is an accident. The same bad decision repeated 20 times becomes policy. Violation notices increased dramatically after Linda became president. Appeals nearly disappeared. Collections rose every year. Legal expenses climbed even faster. Then I found something even more interesting. Nearly every contractor hired by the HOA seemed connected to the same property management company. The same company happened to collect rent on several investment homes throughout the subdivision, including Linda's. Charles noticed the expression on my face. You found it. I found a connection. Not proof. No. I closed the folder. But enough to justify asking questions. Late that afternoon, there was a knock at the front door. Not one person. 3. Rebecca stood beside Harold, accompanied by an elderly woman I immediately recognized from the photographs inside the previous owner's files. I'm Eleanor Price, she said softly. The Rose Garden. I smiled. I've seen your pictures. She looked surprised. The former owner documented everything. Tears briefly filled her eyes. I thought nobody believed us. Harold carefully removed a thick envelope from under his arm. We've all kept records. Rebecca added another folder. So have we. Within minutes, my dining room table disappeared beneath years of letters, photographs, violation notices, certified mail receipts, handwritten notes, and meeting agendas. No dramatic revelations. No smoking gun. Something much stronger. Consistency. Every story was different. Every pattern was the same. Linda had never needed to invent power. She only needed everyone else to believe she already had it. The sun dipped lower outside, casting long golden shadows across the hardwood floor as silence settled over the room. Nobody spoke for nearly a minute. Finally, Eleanor rested one weathered hand on the growing stack of documents. "We're not asking you to save us." I looked around the table. Harold nodded. Rebecca offered a tired smile. "We're just asking someone to make sure the rules finally apply to everyone." I looked at the mountain of paperwork spread across my dining room. Saturday had started with one unopened envelope. Now the evidence covered an entire table. And for the first time since buying the house, I realized this story had never been about becoming Linda Whitaker's landlord. That was only the door. The real fight had been waiting behind it all along. 3 weeks later, my dining room looked less like the inside of a home and more like the evidence room of a courthouse. Every folder had a color: blue for violation notices, green for county property records, yellow for meeting minutes, red for correspondence that had never received a response. The faint smell of printer toner mixed with fresh sawdust from the renovation work taking place down the hallway. Nail guns popped rhythmically in the distance while sunlight poured across stacks of documents that told the same story from a dozen different voices. Nobody had coordinated their evidence. That was exactly why it was so convincing. Harold's records matched Rebecca's. Rebecca's photographs matched Eleanor's letters. The previous owner's files filled the missing gaps. Individually, they looked like ordinary neighborhood disputes. Together, they revealed a pattern no reasonable person could ignore. Charles closed another folder. "I think we've reached the point where we stop collecting and start acting." He nodded. "I've already prepared formal requests." The first went to the HOA board requesting copies of financial records and enforcement policies. The second requested preservation of all electronic communications related to violations issued during Linda's presidency. The third notified the association that several homeowners had retained independent legal representation regarding potential selective enforcement. Nothing dramatic, just certified mail. In my experience, certified mail scares dishonest people far more than angry speeches ever could. By Thursday afternoon, the atmosphere inside Ashford Ridge had changed completely. Neighbors no longer whispered only behind closed doors. They spoke in driveways. They compared letters. They discovered identical fines issued for completely different reasons. One family had been cited because their mailbox was allegedly the wrong shade of black. Another because holiday decorations remained visible 12 hours beyond an unofficial deadline that didn't appear anywhere in the governing documents. Every conversation uncovered another piece. The pattern kept growing. Then Linda made the mistake I had quietly expected. She called an emergency HOA board meeting. The notice described it as a discussion regarding community stability and outside interference. Outside interference. I smiled when I read those words. Funny. According to county records, I now lived inside the community. There wasn't anything outside about me. The clubhouse filled quickly that evening. The smell of brewed coffee mixed with old carpet and furniture polish as folding chairs scraped across the floor. Board members sat at the front beneath framed photographs celebrating neighborhood beautification awards. Linda walked to the podium wearing the same confident expression I'd seen on Saturday morning. But confidence built on assumptions has a short lifespan. She immediately pointed toward me. "This individual has been attempting to undermine the association." I remained seated. No interruption. No argument. She continued describing me as an investor trying to create unnecessary conflict. Then she held up several of the certified letters we'd sent. "These threats are designed to intimidate volunteers." Charles quietly leaned toward me. Interesting choice of words. Very. When Linda finally asked whether anyone wished to address the board, something unexpected happened. Not me. Harold stood first. Then Rebecca. Then Eleanor. One by one, homeowners rose from their chairs carrying folders almost identical to mine. The soft sound of paper hitting tables echoed through the room. Another folder. Then another. And another. Nobody shouted. Nobody accused. They simply handed over copies of years of documented correspondence. The silence became almost uncomfortable. Even several board members looked genuinely surprised by the volume of material appearing before them. Linda glanced across the growing stacks with visible uncertainty. For the first time, she wasn't controlling the meeting. The documents were. I never needed to attack her credibility. Her own paperwork was beginning to do that far more effectively than I ever could. As I watched the board members slowly opening folder after folder, I realized something important. The strongest evidence isn't the loudest. It's the evidence that quietly repeats the same truth until nobody can honestly pretend they haven't seen it. Justice didn't arrive with flashing lights or dramatic speeches. It arrived in the mail. 6 weeks after that Saturday morning, certified envelopes began appearing across Ashford Ridge. One reached every board member. Another went to the association's insurance carrier. Copies landed with county officials and the attorneys representing several homeowners. Nobody had filed a personal vendetta. We had simply submitted evidence. The investigation moved quietly, almost disappointingly so. There were no television cameras parked outside the clubhouse. No shouting matches in the street. Just requests for records, interviews, financial reviews, and long hours spent comparing years of decisions against the governing documents everyone claimed to follow. Truth has a peculiar habit. It rarely needs help. It only needs time. By early autumn, the board held another meeting. This time, the room felt different. Gone were the polished speeches about community standards. The smell of fresh coffee still drifted through the clubhouse, but the confidence had disappeared. Chairs filled with homeowners who no longer looked at the floor. They looked directly at the front table. Linda entered without the certainty she'd worn every day before. She looked tired, smaller somehow. The independent review had concluded that multiple enforcement actions failed to follow the association's own procedures. Several fines were withdrawn. Appeal processes were rewritten. Financial oversight shifted to an outside management company until new elections could be completed. No one declared Linda a villain. The documents simply refused to support many of her decisions. She resigned before the meeting ended. No applause followed. No celebration. Just silence. Sometimes silence says everything applause never could. A few weeks later, I found myself standing outside the rental house on Cedar Hollow Lane. The maple trees had already begun dropping golden leaves across the driveway. The crisp autumn air carried the smell of dry grass and distant fireplaces. Linda opened the front door before I knocked. Neither of us spoke for a moment. Then she quietly said, "I expected something different." "So did I. You could have evicted me." "I could have." She looked down. "But you didn't." I shook my head. "You paid your rent." She looked confused. "I bought a property." I smiled faintly. Not a person. The tension that had lived between us for weeks seemed to loosen all at once. "I'm not interested in humiliating anyone," I continued. "I'm interested in people following the same rules they expect everyone else to follow." For the first time since we'd met, she didn't argue. She simply nodded. "I understand." Whether she truly did or not, I honestly couldn't say. It wasn't my job to rewrite her past, only to manage the property fairly. The renovation of my own house finished before Thanksgiving. Fresh cedar shutters framed the windows. The old oak floors shined again after decades beneath worn carpet. Children rode bicycles past the driveway without parents nervously calling them inside. Rebecca's family hosted neighborhood barbecues. Harold planted flowers along the entrance sign. Eleanor's rose garden bloomed brighter than ever. Ashford Ridge looked almost exactly the same. It simply felt different. One evening, I stood on my front porch listening to the familiar crunch of tires rolling slowly down the street. The same sprinklers hissed across green lawns. The same breeze rustled the oak trees overhead. Only one thing had truly changed. People no longer confused authority with ownership. I smiled, slipped my house keys into my pocket, and looked toward the neighborhood entrance where everything had started. The day I told the HOA I wasn't a member, they thought they had found an outsider. Instead, they accidentally introduced themselves to their new landlord. And I was reminded of something worth remembering. Justice isn't loud. It's patient. It's documented. And sooner or later, it always finds the right address.